So we've all heard the expression keeping up with the Joneses, but nowadays people have gotten pretty creative. So it's no longer just the Joneses, you can also keep up with the Williams or the Johnsons. But regardless of who we place on this pedestal, most people know exactly what this means. And as someone who creates content on money and personal finance, along with encouraging better budgeting and spending less than you earn, not keeping up is something that we often stress a lot. Because regardless of where your income falls, meaning it doesn't matter if you earn a little or a lot, trying to maintain the same lifestyle as another person keeps a lot of people stuck in a rut. But the good news is that I think more and more people are really starting to get it, because I often will read comments and I will see videos of people talking about how they're not upgrading their lifestyle when their income increases and how they're learning to be more content. But one thing I have noticed through observation is that sometimes, and I do stress sometimes, even when a person doesn't think that they're keeping up with the Joneses or maybe another family, sometimes they secretly are. However, it's usually on a much smaller scale and it's subtle, so they don't even realize that it's happening. So one sign that you might be secretly keeping up with the Joneses is that you're embarrassed over good financial decisions, and the best way to describe this is with an example. So several weeks ago, I stumbled upon this Reddit post, and the person who made the comment had a multiple six-figure household, and it was a couple, so two people working. And I can't really remember how much they made a year, but for some reason 300,000 is like sticking in my head. So I think it was around that amount. But even with their high income, they chose to live well beneath their means. They didn't drive expensive cars, and overall they kept their spending on the lower end because they knew in the long run it would be financially beneficial to their family, and because of this they were able to save a lot of money every month. But even though this person was doing everything right and they were in a good place financially, they were also embarrassed by their good financial decisions because their family, friends, and others in their circle had bigger homes, nicer cars, and just more stuff. But what's interesting is that not only were they embarrassed, they also feared their children being embarrassed because they didn't have as much as their peers. And I have to say, that was actually a new one for me. I don't think I've ever heard anyone quite describe it like that, because usually when you have someone who's living well beneath their means, and it's a decision that they made intentionally, oftentimes those people will own that decision, and that is something that they are very proud of. So the whole thing was pretty unique because on one hand they weren't keeping up with the Joneses because they were making decisions that had their family's best interest in mind, but then on the other hand they also feared being viewed or being seen as the poor family member or the poor friend, even though they were far from it. And I don't know the outcome of their story, so I don't know if they stayed in their smaller home or if they upgraded to something bigger. But either way, bottom line is that as we're doing our own self-evaluation or self-reflection, we can ask ourselves a question: do we become embarrassed by our good financial decisions, even though we know that those decisions will only benefit us in the long run? You might also be secretly keeping up with the Joneses if you have to one-up people. And this happens to be one of my biggest financial pet peeves, but I also realize that when it happens, it's not always intentional and people are not always trying to be malicious with it. But I know that some people will do this every time you share something good or exciting about yourself with them, and it's as if they are physically unable to let others have their moment, and I know you know what I'm talking about. But even though we might know people like this, sometimes we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and think about how we respond to others when they're excited and sharing good news with us. So in other words, do you allow other people to have their moment when they're sharing something about themselves, maybe a new job or a recent trip that they went on? Or do you feel the urge to jump in and take over the conversation talking about yourself because you want them to know that your life is just as exciting, so you downplay their entire experience? You might also be secretly keeping up if you don't invite people to your home. Now, there is no rule that says you have to have company. Some people don't like hosting and others don't like having people in their space, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I recently saw a video of a lady admitting that even though she loves being around people and she's very outgoing, she never invites people to her home. And it's not because she doesn't like people in her space. She said that she would love to host like a game night or have a dinner party or have her friends over for a girls' night. but she doesn't. And the reason is because she feels as if her home is not as aesthetically pleasing as her friends. And she went as far as saying that she was not planning to host anything until she was able to buy new furniture for her living room, redecorate, and I think she even wanted to redo her kitchen. But the crazy thing about this whole story is that from what I could see, the house looked nice. I mean, granted, she didn't take us around and give us a house tour, but just from what I can see in the background, there was furniture. It was even decorated, and the space looked newer. So I was kind of scratching my head about that, but either way, she wasn't happy with the space because she was comparing it to what her friends had, and as a result, she didn't invite people over. You might also be secretly keeping up with the Joneses if you return items after shopping with friends. Now, I have to say, I am a big fan of returning items, especially if you experience buyer's remorse after a purchase, or if you later decide that you don't need something. There's really no point of letting an item collect dust. But as much as I believe in going back and getting your money if something doesn't work out, I also believe in a little self-awareness when returning items, and you should look for certain patterns. Because I know for a fact that there are people who will go shopping with friends and they will buy a bunch of items and then later return all or some of the items because they couldn't afford them. And the reasons for this vary. Some people will get so caught up in the excitement of shopping to the point where their entire budget just gets thrown out the window. But then you have people who do this because they're trying to save face and they care too much about the opinion of their friends. So they want to give the illusion that they have extra money to spend when they really don't. You might also be secretly keeping up if you're leasing a car that you can't afford to buy. And I realize that this might strike a nerve with some people, but at the same time, I also feel that there are some people who might need to hear this. So if this tip does not apply to you, just let it fly. Now, personally, I have nothing against leasing. Some people might only need a car temporarily, or they like getting a new car every few years, in which case this makes sense for them. And yes, the payments with the lease are lower than buying. So sometimes this is a person's only option for affordable transportation. But with any financial decision, you should also consider your motive. And in this case, you need to consider your real reason for choosing a lease over buying. Because the reality is, and don't shoot the messenger, I'm only repeating what I've heard others admit, but the reality is, some people's only reason for leasing a car is because they care about image. And by leasing, they're able to drive a luxury car that they wouldn't otherwise be able to afford. And in their mind, they might justify leasing by saying that the payment is lower or that the payment is comparable to what you would pay for an average price car and that they're able to save the difference, which might be true. But if you're getting a car with the sole purpose of trying to impress other people, regardless of how much you're saving every month, you're still trying to keep up. You might also be secretly keeping up with the Joneses if you stop taking your lunch to work. Spending money on food outside the house every single day can get expensive, especially with inflation. So if you work full-time outside of the house, one thing that you should do from time to time is conduct a little lunch audit, where basically you take the number of times that you're currently eating out for lunch and you compare that with the number of times you used to eat out, maybe a few weeks ago, months ago, or even a few years ago. And the reason why this is so important is because one thing I learned from working in an office years ago is that the pressure to dine out for lunch is real. Some days you might have no intentions of going out or ordering in, yet some of your coworkers might frequently invite you to go out with the group, and of course, there's nothing wrong with going from time to time. Just know that on a smaller scale, you might still be trying to keep up with the Joneses, especially if you stop bringing your lunch altogether or if you do it less frequently, because one, you don't want to feel left out, or two, you don't want people to think that you can't afford it. You might also be secretly keeping up with the Joneses if you lose your frugal edge when you're around certain people. Sometimes being frugal is so much easier when you're around frugal people, because if your friends or family have a similar mindset and you guys have similar goals and values, you can support each other and it's easier to maintain these habits. But the same way a person's frugal ways might rub off on you, so can a person's non-frugal ways. And as I've mentioned before, when you're being thrifty, some people might make negative comments or call you cheap. And if this is something that you have experienced in the past, when you are with certain people, you might have a tendency to kind of let your frugal guard down, and you might do things that you wouldn't normally do because you don't want to hear their comments. And to give you an example, when you go to a restaurant or a retail store, you might look for coupons because you know it's a great way to save money, or you might wait for sales. But even though this is your normal pattern, you might not use a coupon when you're with certain people because of what they might think. So if they're paying full price, you pay full price too because you want to be socially accepted by them. So that's all that I have for you guys today. Don't forget to like, comment, and share, and also subscribe if you like personal finance and you want to see more videos like this. I typically post every weekend, so thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in a few days.